Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 in our skeleton series. More this week as we continue to look at these biographical stories, these stories of people, individuals who have some skeletons. And today we want to look at one that probably is one that comes to mind when you think of biblical characters who had a skeleton or two. Of course, his name is Peter. Let me start a story here. After the resurrection, days following the resurrection of Jesus, the men have gathered back in the Sea of Galilee area, or the lake at Tiberias, or the Sea of Tiberias. And in John 21, we pick up the story, and we read a little bit about what's taking place in these moments. Let me read this for you. Starting in verse 1, it says, "After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 others of his disciples were together. I'm going fishing, Simon Peter said to them. We're coming with you, they told him. They went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing." You know, one of the toughest skeletons that we sometimes have to deal with as believers are those moments of spiritual failure. When we realize that there have been choices made in our life that we knew we shouldn't have made, that have cost us some things, have left us feeling shame and regret, remorse over those decisions. That certainly would be true for Peter. Here we are, days after the resurrection of Jesus, which should have been a joyous time, and yet Peter is still struggling because of a decision he made, a decision that Jesus told him he would make. And because of that, Peter has decided that maybe all the things that had been in the experience of his life for the last 3.5 years were now finished. And he goes back to what he was doing before. Of course, before he followed Jesus and began that ministry with Jesus across to Israel, he had been a fisherman, and apparently had been a fisherman for generations. His family had lived there at the Sea of Galilee, and they had fished and used that as their way of life. And so now, seeing that the things that had been part of his relationship with Jesus had come to an end, he goes back to what he knew best. And he tells all these other men who were fishermen as well, I'm going fishing. They go with him, maybe because of his leadership, maybe because they're not sure what to do either. But either way, Peter went because he figured the things that he had experienced were over. Well, what happened? Now, I think we may remember his story, but I want to go back and I want to look for just a few minutes at what did take place. Of course, gathered in the upper room there that night before Jesus was arrested and ultimately crucified, Peter was warned by Jesus that there would be a moment of failure, a moment where he would make a fateful decision and deny him. In John chapter 18, we read about that. Jesus has been arrested. He's on his way to Caiaphas' house, the high priest. And in verse 15 of John 18, the Bible says, Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest, so he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter remained standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went in and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who was the doorkeeper said to Peter, Aren't you one of the man's disciples too? Are you? I am not, he said. Now the servants and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. Well, Peter denies Jesus, denies knowing him. 3.5 years of ministry and friendship. In just a moment, in just a second, Peter says, I'm not that man. I don't know who he is. You would think that would be the end of it, that Peter's heart would have gripped him, that he would have thought, man, this is too much. But instead, we find that it goes forward. Jesus is now being questioned, and he's taking those moments to begin those last hours of his life. And Peter, standing by the fire, in verse 25, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. And they said to him, Aren't you one of his disciples too? Are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Peter denied it again. And immediately, a rooster crowed. Not once, not twice, but 3 times Peter denied Jesus. And now here we are, days later, at the Sea of Galilee, or as John 21 describes it, the Sea of Tiberias. And Peter's still reeling from it all. He's seen Jesus. He's had a conversation with Jesus, and yet he is still not sure where he is in that relationship anymore. He's denied Jesus. He's denied him over and over and over again. And now here he is fishing late into the night. As we read the story on, we know that Peter and the other disciples who were with him fishing caught nothing. As day breaks and they begin to finish up the night without any catch, Jesus appears there on the seashore. And he calls out and asks them about their catch. When they tell him they've caught nothing, he commands them to cast the net on the other side of the boat, where they catch so many fish that the net is almost breaking. They were unable to haul the fish in. And Peter knows immediately that Jesus is the one who's speaking to them. He jumps in, swims to shore to get close to Jesus. They all come in with a fish. They enjoy a breakfast together there at the seashore. And then Peter and Jesus walk away. When they had finished breakfast, verse 15, John 21 now, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you. Feed my lambs," he told them. A second time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep," he told them. He asked him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved. And when he asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep," Jesus said. In the moments that took place in this conversation, Peter has to confront his skeleton. He has to deal with the fact that he's denied Jesus those 3 times on that last night. Peter has to come face to face with the skeleton and make a decision. Will he be able to get rid of the skeleton, move forward, and reestablish that relationship, confessing and moving forward in a way that frees him from that skeleton in his past? Or would he allow it to continue to be something that hangs over him and keeps him far away? In the moments where Jesus answered, we find that as Jesus asked the third time, "Do you love me?" Peter is grieved, broken over his sin. Think of it as a moment of confession where Peter finally says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Peter was free. We've been talking these last 3 weeks and one more week to go about skeletons and how they come up from our past and oftentimes keep us from enjoying the future that God has planned for us. Until we confront them, until we confess them, we'll always be trapped. But the Bible tells us that if we confess our sin, He is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us. When Peter made his confession, he was free. What's stopping you from making that same step of faith, making that same confession over your skeleton, your sin, and finding that same freedom? There'll be some questions for you if you're doing this alone or as a group to follow up with and find some time of discussion and reflection. And we'll see you here next week for week 4 in this incredible series called Skeletons.